Welcome to the Crime Redefined podcast, produced by Zero Cliff Media. Coming to you from the US Bank Tower, high above downtown Los Angeles. In our podcast, we drill deep into forensics and criminal investigation from the viewpoint of the defense, as well as explore the intersection of the media and the justice system.
I'm Dion Mitchell here with Mehul and Anjaria. On today's episode of Crime Redefined, we're super excited to feature as our guest one of the lead LAPD detectives that handled the Sandra Bullock stalking case.
Yeah, he's a real interesting guy. Our interview guest today, Jeff Dunn, recently retired from the LAPD as the head of the Threat Management Unit, aka TMU. He was with LAPD for 32 years, where he investigated or supervised thousands of stalking and threat-related cases. He also specialized in cases involving burglary, child abuse, and sexual assault. Mr. Dunn is routinely sought out as a subject matter expert on the topic of threat assessment for television programs, magazine and newspaper articles, and forensic case studies.
And in addition to all of that, you may have seen Jeff recently on the 2020 special commemorating the 30-year anniversary of the tragic death of actress Rebecca Schaeffer at the hands of a stalker. Jeff also recently provided on-camera commentary for REELZChannel Stalker Files, a 10-episode series that Mehul and I were executive producers on.
Well, Dion, let's get into the backstory. On June 8th, 2014, actress Sandra Bullock was at her Bel Air home and heard some suspicious noises. As she peeked out her bedroom door, she observed Joshua James Corbett approaching her. Fortunately, she was able to lock herself in a panic room in her closet and notify authorities. When Corbett was arrested, he had a love letter on him that read, "Sandy, you could have had me today, however you chose other people over me. I will be around. As you know, I love you. You are very special to me, and without you in my life, there is only misery. I have to wait, and you never come. Perhaps this all is supposed to happen some other way. Perhaps Hawaii or run in on the street. Who knows? I have no idea. I love you and Louie, and only want to be part of your life. I miss you very much, and I think of you every moment of every day. You are my girl. I saw you come home after the AFI gala and only wished I was at the entrance to your heart when you came home. There is 2 large, impervious gates that no one can open but you. I hope one day you open them to me. Until then, I will forever be thinking of you and Louie, my son. And you are my wife by law, the law of God, and you belong to me and me to you. I forgive you for anything you may have done and only want the chance to love you as you have so made me feel loved. If lover, I will be waiting by those gates, and when you decide to open them to me, I will run to you and forever and always as love and love always. You are so hot and intelligent, and I will call you. Please remember me when you feel the need to let someone in, always and forever. Love, your husband, Joshua James Corbett, dated 6/7/14 at 10:37 a.m. Now, the date of this letter was one day before Corbett actually broke into Sandra Bullock's house.
And then Corbett was arrested in Sandra Bullock's home that night. After a lengthy legal process, he was sentenced to 5 years probation and mental health treatment. Last year, police were dispatched to Corbett's residence after he failed to show up for a court date. After a standoff with police, unfortunately, Corbett took his own life. Crime Redefined is proud to bring you this exclusive interview in which you will learn new and fascinating details about this unfortunate case of the stalking of Sandra Bullock.
Let's do it.
Hi, Jeff. Thank you so much for joining us today on Crime Redefined.
Well, thank you guys for having me.
So first question out of the gate is, now that you're retired, what do you miss most about the Threat Management Unit?
If anything.
Well, of course, you miss the people. You do build a camaraderie with the people that you work with and you work around. And, I miss that daily interaction with them. But, quite frankly, I don't miss a lot of the late night phone calls and from the mayor's office and the chief's office. It's nice to get a good night's sleep for a change. So I still keep in touch with the people I used to work with. And we do lunch every now and then. So I get my fix that way.
Just curiously, do they ever reach out to you for, as the seasoned veteran, like, hey, we're working on this case, or for any insight, or is it just more of just, like you said, camaraderie and catching up with your team, your ex-team?
No, they do. In fact, I got an email today from one of the guys I used to work with. They have a problem with the paparazzi, cropping up again. And that's something that I dealt with periodically for, 20 or so years while I was running the unit. So I just directed them to some of the fact sheets that I wrote once upon a time, and hopefully they can glean the information from that. But if they have any follow-up questions, they know they can always reach out to me.
So, Jeff, give us a little bit of an overview of the threat management unit and also what the elements of a stalking charge actually are.
Well, sure. The threat management unit basically got its start following the Rebecca Schaeffer murder in 1989. Prior to that case, there were no stalking laws in California or anywhere else for that matter. But that was kind of the tipping point for stalking laws throughout the United States. California was first on board, largely as a result of that case and what happened with actress Teresa Saldana and David Letterman and others. But that was kind of the tipping point. And once the law came into effect, the Los Angeles Police Department looked at that case and they said, well, you know what? There were some real red flags here that somebody should have seen or should have been able to intercept along that pathway to violence. And those types of services and that type of investigation typically goes beyond what traditional law enforcement responses are to crime reports. So in its insight, the Los Angeles Police Department decided to create a threat management type unit specifically to address cases like that, long-term obsessive type behavior that result in stalking. And that's initially how we started back in 1991, largely as a result of the Rebecca Schaeffer case again. But, our mission at that point was to deal with celebrity type stalking cases, and we were dealing frequently with the entertainment studios and liaisoning with them. But as, time progressed and more acts of targeted violence occurred, our responsibilities increased to the point that we're not only handling stalking cases now, but we're also handling workplace violence cases involving city departments and city employees, threats to the city's elected officials, and other acts or threats of targeted violence.
Well, I have two quick follow-ups. So you work directly with the studios and or the networks that you would actually get calls from them to say, hey, listen, one of our celebs, our stars are getting, are getting harassed?
Yes. As a matter of fact, at one point in time, I had 8 detectives working for me, and each one of those detectives were assigned 2 studios to liaison with, so that they would be the point of contact should they have a problem similar to what you just described. They wouldn't have to go through the chain of calling the front desk of Hollywood division, getting some desk officer that scratched out a memo and forwarded it to a detective only to be followed up on, a couple of days later. Now they had a direct report to us.
That had to be huge for them. That they
it was huge for them and it was huge for us because we're getting the information unfiltered too. We're getting it direct from the source as opposed to reading an officer's interpretation of what was described to him. We're getting it direct from the source. So it was beneficial to us from an investigative standpoint, and it was beneficial to the victims and to the studios because they were getting an immediate response to the problem. What department or task force were you working with before, and what was the draw to TMU for you? Well, actually, I had made detective about a year prior. And typically when you get promoted on the police department, you don't get to stay in your previous assignment. They rotate you to where there's a need. And so I got promoted to detective, and I rotated to the mental evaluation unit out of Detective Headquarters Division, which, oddly, coincidentally, was also where the threat management unit got its start. But now that I'm housed in the same division with the threat management unit, when an opening became available, I applied, and gratefully I got the job in 1994, and I stayed with it until I retired in 2016.
So, Jeff, you kind of touched on this already, but besides the Sandra Bullock stalking case that we're going to focus on today, what are some of the other high-profile, interesting cases you were involved in during your tenure with the LAPD?
Well, we were involved in a lot of high-profile cases. Most of them never made it to the media's attention. And so I'm not going to talk about a case that's otherwise not public information. But, the Madonna case is well documented. We worked on the Madonna case. Steven Spielberg was a victim of stalking. We worked on the Steven Spielberg case. We assisted on the Catherine Zeta-Jones stalking case with the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department. There were a number of high-profile cases. Brad Pitt. among many others. But some of them are public information. So out of respect to the victims, I don't want to talk about them at this point.
Understood.
Yeah, of course. Prior to the Corbett Sandra Bullock case, had you had any contact with her on previous cases?
Yeah, she's well, Sandra Bullock is one of those actresses that, she's very congenial, Miss Congeniality.
Nice.
But on screen, she comes across as very approachable, very down to earth. And in fact, in real life, she's a very nice person. So people like that typically generate a lot of attention, and sometimes it's unwanted attention. And there had been prior cases involving her.
What was your official role on the Joshua Corbett case?
Well, I was running the unit. I was the officer in charge of the unit. So I assigned the case to one of my detectives, Tina Carlozzi, who was fairly new to the unit at that time. So I assisted her in the investigation as her partner officer.
Well, what a trial by fire, right into the here you go. Sandra Bullock, and jump on
that's
this.
How that. I'm sorry to interrupt, but that's how that unit is. I mean, most everything that we dealt with was high profile, whether it involved a celebrity or one of our city's elected officials or city departments. It was always the chief's office or the mayor's office that wanted frequent updates. And sometimes they got media attention, sometimes they didn't. But every one of our cases was a high profile case that was under a lot of scrutiny.
Now, at some point, I know that you interviewed him. What was your first impression when you interviewed him at LAPD jail?
Clearly, Joshua had a mental illness, and his mental illness was what was driving his behavior. We do our background check before we go into those types of interviews, and for whatever we can find on the computer, it was clear that he was not an evil guy. He certainly wasn't a career criminal. There was nothing in the way of drug history or criminal history that we could find. He did have some firearms registered to him. So, by all measures, he was an otherwise law-abiding citizen that developed schizophrenia, and that's what was driving his behavior as it was regarding Miss Bullock, and it affected other areas of his life as well. His family suffered, and he lost his wife and his child. So, it's a devastating illness, and that was my first impression in talking with him. He was quite delusional.
And that was just right out of the gate. You sat down, you're looking across the table for a moment, and you're just like, okay, this guy's not all here.
Well, that and some of the things that were recovered on him at the time that he was arrested. That he had a journal with him, a 15-page journal where he was outlining the level of his obsession. He believed that he was married to Sandra Bullock. He believed that he was the father of her adopted child. And just so you know, she's white. Joshua Corbett was white. Her adopted son is African American. So, probably,
that's a problem.
Yeah, that kind of demonstrates the level of, delusion that he had. But, quite delusional in his writings. And he wrote a love letter to her proclaiming that she was his wife and that they were going to be together at some point. Taking that into account, and then how he presented during the interview, it was pretty apparent to me that we were dealing with somebody with a significant illness.
So prior to him actually entering Sandra Bullock's house, had he been previously observed hanging out around her house?
Well, not that she had noticed personally, but after the fact, once he was arrested, she does have surveillance cameras on her property, and we were able to access the surveillance tapes. And we know for a fact that for at least 3 days prior to him entering her house, he was parked across the street surveilling the residence, oftentimes for multiple hours at a time. On one occasion, he was there from 10 in the morning until 11 o'clock at night. He would often get out of his car, walk past the front gate, ring the doorbell, try to make contact with people inside. Even his journal that he had with him at the time that he was arrested shows that he was there for at least 3 nights prior to the actual break-in.
And how, physically did he break into her house?
Well, she's got these, let me see if I can describe it. She had these dual sliding glass doors that accessed her patio to the rear of the house. And these sliding glass doors meet in the middle, and there's a deadlock type latch that secures the 2 doors. Also, at the base of the 2 doors, there's a pin that goes into the floor that keeps the doors from, sliding back and forth and swaying back and forth. Well, she had locked the deadbolt, but she hadn't placed the pins into the floor. So that gave these 2 doors a little bit of play. And what he had done is he forced the doors back and forth until there was enough of an opening that the deadbolt disengaged, and he was able to gain access that way.
And what else did Corbett have on him when he was arrested?
Well, he had a concealed weapons permit from the state of Utah, which was a bit concerning, especially after we did his weapons check and we discovered that he had 8 firearms registered to him. Some of them were handguns. So, here we got a guy that has a concealed weapons permit. So, conceivably he's proficient with guns. And in fact, he's got 8 guns registered to him. So that was quite concerning.
Did he also have some kind of magazine cutouts of Sandra Bullock with him as well?
He did. I think there were 4 or 5 photographs of her that he had cut out of various entertainment type tabloids and had with him with his journal and the love letter intended for her, as well as, the other items inside of his wallet, which included that concealed weapons permit.
So now kind of looking at the other side of the coin, how did Sandra Bullock initially become aware that someone was in her house? And how was it that she could prevent a physical encounter with Corbett?
Well, it's hard to imagine and put yourself in that position, but she had arrived home from an entertainment event about 1 o'clock in the morning, that same morning, and she immediately showered and went to bed. So she was asleep, and at about 6 o'clock in the morning, she was awakened by loud banging, which we now know were those 2 glass doors being forced open. So she looked outside of her bedroom door after a period of time and saw Joshua walking past her bedroom door on the second floor of her home. She lived in a 3-level home. Her bedroom's on the second floor. And as she cracked her door and peeked outside, she could see Joshua walking past her door as he was presumably going room to room searching for her. So she immediately locked her door. She had a bit of a safety room. She was fortunate in that she had a private security guard by the name of Wire Reader, who was a former SWAT officer for the Los Angeles Police Department. So he had some insight as far as security, and he was able to set up sort of a safety room for her in her walk-in closet. He fortified the door, and he put a phone line inside of her closet. She was able to lock her bedroom door, secure herself inside of her walk-in closet, and make a phone call from inside of her walk-in closet.
Did I read something that Corbett was kind of studying the security guard and what his routine was?
Well, that was his statement. When we asked him why he had forcibly entered the house and was actively looking for Sandra Bullock, his statement was that he was just trying to show her that she was vulnerable and that the security guard wasn't doing his job and that her location or her house was penetrable. So I don't know if that was so much an accurate statement on his part or a way to take away some of the blame from his stalking type behavior. But that was certainly a statement that he made.
I had read in a transcript that one of the arresting officers said that Corbett, once he was arrested, kept saying, "Sandy, Sandy, Sandy, please don't press charges." And, "I'm sorry. I love you, Sandy." And he appeared just kind of out of it. Jeff, in your professional opinion, what does that kind of indicate to you about his mental defect?
Well, I think that in conjunction with the writings that he had on his person certainly, solidified my impression that he had a thought disorder. When we deal, having worked the threat man, just to back up a little bit, having worked the threat management unit for as long as I did, and having handled so many celebrity cases, one thing that we do see from time to time is a mental illness called erotomania. And erotomania quite often is a feature of schizophrenia, but it's the false belief that someone rich or famous is in love with you. We saw it in the Madonna case. We saw it in the Catherine Zeta-Jones, Michael Douglas case. We've seen it in other cases involving high-profile celebrities. And this was just a feature of that. And so it was completely consistent with what we've experienced before. Calling out to Miss Bullock, claiming that he loved her and that he was sorry, please don't press charges. It indicated that he felt that there was some sort of a relationship between the two of them.
You mentioned the firearms. What other evidence did you find at his residence in addition to the firearms? And I understand that there was a number of other firearms that weren't registered, that he didn't have a license for.
Yeah, that's correct. One thing that we did, the responding patrol officers did at the time that he was arrested is they sought an emergency protective order protecting Miss Bullock and preventing him from going anywhere near her for a period of, usually they're good for about 72 hours. And the officers couldn't know how long he was going to be in custody because things happen with the court system and with jail. So they saw fit to get the emergency protective order on behalf of Miss Bullock. So what that emergency protective order does is it carries with it a firearm restriction. It requires that Joshua has to divest himself of any and all firearms in his possession And he could do that in any number of ways. He can sell them, which was not practical because he was in jail. He could sign them over to somebody else, which is not practical because he was in jail, or he could surrender them to the police. So with that as the background, when we interviewed Joshua, we pushed to get those firearms. I was quite concerned about the fact that here we have a guy that's clearly delusional, clearly acting on his compulsions, and he's got several firearms that we know of that are registered to him. And now we have a court order that says we can seize those firearms, thereby safeguarding the victim and public. So that was our focus. We ultimately went to his house, and we opened up his gun safes. And I know you'll want to get into this in a minute, but far more firearms than we knew that he had registered to him. He had 25 firearms in total. Some of them were converted to fully automatic. Most of them were assault-type rifles, several hundred pounds of ammunition, and some explosive devices. So we, of course, seized those. But in addition to those, we also seized computers. We did a search warrant on his home. We located basically a shrine to Sandra Bullock inside of his bedroom, where he was writing with a permanent marker on the walls, cryptic messages directed to her, proclaiming his love and their relationship. It was quite a shrine.
Interesting. So, Jeff, how did you feel about Corbett's ultimate sentence of, I think it was 5 years probation and time in a mental health treatment facility?
I got to tell you, I think that ultimately mental health was the preferred way to go with this case. Again, I said it initially, Joshua Corbett wasn't an evil person. He certainly wasn't a career criminal. His mental illness was driving his behavior. I don't believe that he belonged in prison. I do believe that he belonged in a secured mental facility where he wouldn't be able to come and go freely until the staff determined that he was suitable for discharge. Something in the way of mental health treatment, I think, was appropriate in this case. I didn't see this as a state prison type case. But the fact that he was able, in a very short period of time, to get stabilized, and, they do respond to medication. He was stabilized and then discharged from the hospital. So even though he was still on probation, he was on probation as an outpatient, and he was supposed to report back to the court, which ultimately he didn't do. But I think mental health resources were the right call on this particular case. I just don't think it was implemented correctly.
And prior to the legal resolution of the case, he was in county jail for about 3 years?
Yes, I believe so. This case has its preliminary hearing, of course, and that takes some time. The defense attorneys appealed the evidence. They had an evidence hearing, which I testified at. The evidence was initially upheld. When I say evidence, I mean the seizure of all the weapons and the ammunition. That was initially upheld, and then it was appealed, and it worked its way through the appeal process. So ultimately, it went to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals ended up suppressing the evidence, which resulted in the mental health resolution on the case. So it was a long and winding road to get to that point. And during that time, he was in custody.
And would he have been at the Twin Towers facility in county?
As far as I know, he was, yes.
And so, do you think that he was likely receiving adequate mental health while he was in county jail, mental health treatment?
Well, they do have resources there for for the mentally ill. But that said, it's not the in-depth type treatment that he would receive at a medical facility. Basically, it's medication. Nothing in the way of counseling, nothing in the way of, monitoring his behavior with the other inmates, that sort of thing. Basically, it's giving him his medication at the prescribed time interval. So nothing in the way of psychiatric help as you and I would understand it.
If you're comfortable in sharing it with us, can you tell us how the saga of Joshua Corbett finally came to an end?
Yeah, unfortunately, he was a troubled soul. And after he was discharged from the mental health facility, what happened is what often happens in cases like this. Schizophrenics, the medication for schizophrenia and for thought disorders has some very unpleasant side effects. So what we see frequently is that once left to their own devices, subjects will typically try to wean themselves off the medication. Some of the side effects include, sleeplessness and impotence and other things, sluggishness, depression. So what we see frequently is that subjects will try to wean themselves off the medication. And I believe ultimately that's what happened. He fell back into his thought disorder and his mindset, and he started to not attend the regular court appearances, reporting to the court as he was required to do under the terms of his probation, showing that he's complying with all of his outpatient treatment, et cetera, et cetera. He failed to report to the court, and the court ultimately issued a bench warrant for his arrest, which went to the warrant service detail of the Los Angeles Police Department, who in turn contacted the threat management unit because we were the initial case in investigating the investigation. So in conjunction with the TMU, our warrant service officers went out to Corbett's house to effect an arrest based on the bench warrant issued by the court. And he barricaded himself inside, stood at the door and said he would kill anybody that came in after him. He would shoot anybody that came in after him. And ultimately what resulted was a 5 to 6 hour SWAT standoff with Joshua barricaded inside of his home, and he ultimately committed suicide.
And didn't he cut himself? Isn't that how he died?
I believe so. The autopsy report indicated that he died from numerous lacerations to his arms and to his legs. It's just, it's a very tragic outcome.
Really
this is
sad.
This is one of those cases you just can't feel good about. Clearly, he was a normal, law-abiding guy until the onset of his schizophrenia, which is what drove him to do what he did and brought him to police attention. Clearly his family suffered with his mental illness. They suffered through the trial and with the publicity that happened. He certainly suffered with his mental illness. The few interactions I've had with Sandra Bullock, I can tell you that, she's a genuinely nice person. And I think in an abstract way, you could say that maybe his suicide provided her some sort of relief, but I'm sure she doesn't feel that way. This is not the conclusion that she would have liked. So, this is just one of those cases where there was no happy ending. And you really can't feel good about the outcome.
No, I obviously for anyone, whether it's a celebrity or not, you have a lot of compassion. I have a lot of compassion for Sandra Bullock. No one should, in their home have an invader. That's got to be just, the scariest scenario that you can imagine.
Oh,
but
for sure.
But at the same time, if someone's not in their right mind, it's like you were saying, you feel for them, because they just are not in control of their actions. And so, you have to have a little, as a human beings, we have to have a little bit of compassion for him as well.
Sure. And that's not lost on police officers. We feel compassion towards individuals all the time. Usually when you're investigating a case as a cop, you can look back and say, okay, well, I took a real bad actor off the street and, I've enhanced public safety and I provided the victim some relief, et cetera, et cetera. But, that's just not the case with this particular case. I really, truly believe that Joshua Corbett belonged in a secured mental institution for an extended period of time, getting intense treatment and medication. And that just didn't happen on this particular case. And it's a sad outcome for everyone.
Well, why don't we lighten this up a little bit, Dion? What do you think?
Sure.
All right, Jeff, here's the question of the day. Tell us how awesome it was to work with us on Stalker Files and how much fun it was to have us on set staring at you while you did take after take. And that's not an indictment that you were poor or anything like that. I knew it. No, that's not the case. You're a rock solid.
You know what?
Take after excellent take.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know what? It was a good time, and I really enjoyed my time on it. Hopefully, we'll get another season out of it.
Absolutely.
At some point. But no, it was a good time, and most of the cases are entertaining that we worked on, and I know there's a public interest for them, and I don't mind sharing that information when it's already public and there's some information out there about it. I don't mind sharing, our investigative perspective on those types of cases. So it was a fun thing to do. You guys were real good to me.
It was. What's nice about that is that very rarely do you get a kind of a little peek behind the curtain of how these different task force work. And so your expertise and your willingness to share everything in detail was really amazing. And it was a pleasure working with you. And then again, today to have your insight on this case.
Oh, well, thank you guys. And right back at you. It was a pleasure working with you. And hopefully this isn't the end of it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Jeff, for being with us on Crime Redefined today. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, appreciate your time. Thank you, guys.
Wow. What an interesting journey through the Sandra Bullock stalking case. Jeff, I think, really provided us with some great details, and I suspect a lot of those have never been revealed before. Dion, what were your takeaways?
I agree. I did learn a couple of new nuggets in there that I didn't know before, and I can understand why people are so fascinated with this subject matter. Unfortunately, someone must suffer first.
Yeah, that's a good point.
You know, Mr. Defense Guy, what grabbed your attention from the interview?
Well, I thought it was interesting that, given that Corbett had so many guns and so much ammunition and even explosive devices, that it seems like he could have gotten some serious prison time here. But because a lot of that evidence was excluded, the only remaining charges were burglary and stalking. And that actually opened the door for what seemed like was a more appropriate sentence. So I just wanted to point out some of the irony here. A lot of the times the defense gets a bum rap. But here, by pushing the issue and getting those charges thrown out, they actually opened the door for an outcome that was more treatment-based and less punishment-based. And it seemed like Jeff was actually on board with that outcome. So after it all shook out, it seemed like the outcome in terms of the sentence was good for everybody.
I agree. He did seem comfortable with what the terms were at the end. Jeff also mentioned the stalking cases of Madonna, Spielberg, Catherine Zeta-Jones, and all of these stalking cases were featured in episodes of Stalker Files. But another one was the Rebecca Schaeffer case that, according to Jeff, seemed to be the impetus for better laws of investigation and techniques. Do you agree with that? Yeah,
it absolutely was. And so for our listeners who aren't very familiar with that case, Rebecca Schaeffer was a model and actress who was probably best known for her role on the 80s sitcom My Sister Sam. And she starred alongside Pam Dauber, who, of course, is of Mork and Mindy fame. Now, Rebecca Schaeffer had a stalker who was very aggressive. His name was Robert Bardo. And in one incident, he actually tried to get on the Warner Brothers lot to get to her. And ultimately, in 1989, Bardo was able to get her home address, if you can believe that. And he went there. And when Rebecca Schaeffer opened the door, he shot her point blank. And ultimately, this case was tried by Marcia Clark of the LADA's office, who, of course, went on to do the O.J. Simpson case. Yeah, I remember that case, and it was extremely sad. I even remember on the news of him trying to get on the Warner Brothers lot. But it's just crazy. It seems like all high-profile cases all go back to the players involved with the O.J. Simpson case. Yeah, it's almost like 6 degrees of separation with Kevin Bacon.
Yeah, it really is. I can't help but think the impact now of social media has had on these cases. I really believe it's thrown gasoline on it.
Yep.
Because, potential stalkers or people, let's put it this way, they're not going out to be stalkers. They have some degree of mental illness. And now they know where celebrities are, almost 24/7. They feel closer to them. You can go onto Instagram and literally almost see pillow talk sometimes. So I just think it's made it's exacerbated these situations. What do you think?
Well, yeah, and not to mention, I think you could almost make the argument that social media has exacerbated and accelerated the onset of mental illness itself.
Yeah, that's a great point as well.
So another takeaway I had was that, on one hand, Corbett, when he entered Sandra Bullock's house, it wasn't particularly violent the way he did it. I mean, yeah, he jumped over the fence and he found like a loose door. He didn't have any weapons on him. And like Jeff was saying, he made this statement that, well, in a way I was doing her a favor because I was observing her security. And I wanted to point out to Sandra Bullock that her security was very vulnerable and she needs to tighten it up. But obviously he was a danger. I mean, due to his erotomania and all the guns they later found at his house. But one thing that we didn't get into specifically with Jeff was that if you look at the court proceedings, when they talk about that notebook, that 15-pager that Corbett had in his hand, besides all the other bizarre stuff, there was some very salty language that were essentially suggestions that his intention was to sexually assault Sandra Bullock.
That's right. And that, for me, that escalation, I think, is one of the main reasons that we have an LAPD threat management unit today.
Yeah, absolutely. Well said.
This was another really interesting discussion. Thanks, Mehul. And I want to say thank you to our listeners. Be sure to like us on Facebook and follow us on Instagram and Twitter at Crime Redefined.
Thank you for listening to the Crime Redefined podcast. Like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter at Crime Redefined. Please send us your comments and questions and join us for the next episode.